Somewhere in the archives of a small historical society in rural Louisiana, there sits a leather-bound journal that almost no one has ever read. The pages are yellowed, the ink faded to rust, but the words inside detail something that was never supposed to be documented. For nearly 40 years, from 1826 to 1867, someone recorded what happened to enslaved families after they were sold away from Ridgefield Plantation. Not just their names or their sale prices, but where they went, what became of them, and how they died. The entries stop and start without explanation. Some years have dozens of names, other years, nothing. And according to the few historians who've examined it, the handwriting changes at least 3 times. The diary shouldn't exist. During the antebellum period, enslaved people were not supposed to be literate. They weren't supposed to keep records. They certainly weren't supposed to track the systematic destruction of their families across state lines through decades with the kind of meticulous detail that would make a clerk envious. Yet this diary exists, and its existence raises questions that no one has been able to fully answer. Who wrote it? How did they get their information? Why did they risk everything to document something that everyone else was trying to forget? Before we continue with the story of this mysterious diary and the dark truth it contains, if you're hearing this and love untold historical mysteries, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love hearing where our community discovers these forgotten stories. What makes this diary so disturbing isn't just what it documents, but why anyone would have gone to such lengths to track people who were supposed to be forgotten. The answer to that question is darker and more complex than anyone expected. And it begins on a humid morning in June 1826, when 7 people were sold away from the only home they'd ever known. Ridgefield Plantation sat about 12 miles northwest of Natchitoches, Louisiana, in a landscape of moss-draped oaks and red clay roads that turned to thick mud every spring. The plantation wasn't one of the massive sugar estates farther south that dominated the Louisiana economy. It was mid-sized, about 400 acres, producing cotton primarily, some corn for local consumption, and maintaining a herd of pigs that were, by all accounts, mean-tempered and half-wild. The pigs roamed semi-freely through the back sections of the property, foraging in the forest that bordered the plantation's eastern edge. The land itself was unforgiving. The soil was decent for cotton but required constant work, clearing, plowing, planting, weeding, picking. The summers were brutal, with temperatures regularly climbing above 95 degrees and humidity that made the air feel solid. The winters were milder but unpredictable, with occasional freezes that could destroy an entire crop if they came too early or too late. By 1826, when the diary's first entry appears, the plantation had been in the Grantham family for 2 generations. The original Grantham, a man named Robert who'd come from Virginia in the 1780s, had carved the plantation out of wilderness with a combination of borrowed money, ruthless ambition, and the labor of people he'd brought with him in chains. Robert died in 1818, leaving the property to his son James. James Grantham, who inherited the property at age 34, was known in Natchitoches Parish as a meticulous man. He kept detailed ledgers of every seed planted, every bale sold, every dollar spent. His account books, which still survive in the Historical Society's archives, are extraordinary in their precision. He noted the weather each day, the condition of the soil, the health of his livestock, the prices he paid for supplies. He recorded everything except, notably, the lives of the people he enslaved. But he wasn't known as a particularly cruel master by the standards of the time. A low bar, certainly, but one that mattered in the social hierarchy of the parish. He attended St. Augustine's Episcopal Church in Natchitoches every Sunday when the roads were passable. He paid his debts on time, usually. He rarely appeared in court records, which meant he didn't get into public disputes with neighbors or beat his enslaved people so badly that the authorities felt compelled to intervene, something that did happen occasionally, even in She came from a prominent family near Alexandria and brought a small dowry that helped stabilize the plantation's finances. They had 3 children by 1826, William, born in 1821, who would eventually inherit the plantation, Margaret, born in 1823, and an infant daughter named Elizabeth. Catherine ran the household with the same meticulous attention to detail her husband applied to the fields. She supervised the house servants, managed the kitchen, organized the social calendar, and maintained the family's reputation in the parish. The main house at Ridgefield was a 2-story structure built in the Greek Revival style that was becoming fashionable in the South. It had white columns on the front portico, wide galleries on both floors, and tall windows designed to catch whatever breeze might stir the humid air. Inside, the rooms were furnished modestly by plantation standards. Good furniture, but not ostentatious. A piano in the parlor that Catherine played occasionally, a small library with perhaps 40 books. The house had been expanded twice, once by Robert Grantham and once by James, and the additions showed in the slight misalignment of the floorboards and the way the newer sections creaked differently when you walked through them. Behind the main house, about 100 yards away, stood a row of log cabins where the enslaved community lived. There were 8 cabins total, each about 12 feet by 14 feet, with a single room, a dirt floor, and a fireplace that smoked badly when the wind came from the west. Each cabin housed a family, sometimes 2 families if the quarters were crowded. The roofs were made of hand-split cypress shingles that leaked during heavy rains. There were no windows, just wooden shutters that could be closed against the cold. The doors had no locks because enslaved people weren't supposed to have privacy. The enslaved community at Ridgefield numbered around 36 people in 1826. Most of them had been born on the property or purchased from neighboring estates as children. They ranged in age from infants to an elderly woman named Aunt Bess, who was believed to be in her 70s and who'd been at Ridgefield since the plantation's founding. The community was tightly knit, bound together by kinship, shared suffering, and the knowledge that they were all subject to the same arbitrary power. Families at Ridgefield had been relatively stable, at least compared to other plantations. Children grew up knowing their parents. Siblings stayed together. Marriages, though not legally recognized, were generally respected by James Grantham, who understood that stable families meant more productive workers and fewer attempts at escape. That stability, fragile as it was, defined life at Ridgefield. People knew each other's histories, their relatives, their griefs. The cabins might have been small and uncomfortable, but they were home. The work rhythm at Ridgefield followed the cotton season. Spring meant preparing the fields, repairing tools, planting. Summer meant endless weeding, thinning plants, battling insects. Fall meant picking, from dawn until it was too dark to see the bolls. Winter meant ginning the cotton, baling it for transport, making repairs, cutting firewood, and preparing for the next cycle. The overseer, a man named Silas Talbot, enforced the work schedule with threats and occasional violence. Talbot was in his mid-40s, a wiry man with a face weathered by sun and meanness. He'd worked at Ridgefield since 1822, hired by James Grantham after the previous overseer died of yellow fever. Talbot lived in a small house between the main house and the cabins, positioned so he could watch both. He carried a whip and used it when he felt it necessary, which was often enough that everyone understood the threat was real. But despite Talbot's presence, despite the inherent violence of the system, the enslaved community at Ridgefield had managed to create something resembling a life. They had their own social structures, their own leaders, their own ways of supporting each other. Aunt Bess served as a midwife and healer, treating illnesses with herbs and knowledge passed down through generations. An older man named Elias, who worked in the stables, was respected for his wisdom and his ability to settle disputes. A woman named Rose, who worked in the main house, was known for her singing voice and would lead hymns on Sunday evenings when the work was done. The rations at Ridgefield were typical for the region: cornmeal, salt pork, molasses, and whatever vegetables people could grow in small garden plots behind their cabins. It was never quite enough. Hunger was a constant presence, especially in the winter when the garden plots were bare. People supplemented their rations by fishing in the creek that ran through the property, by setting snares for rabbits and possums, by foraging for nuts and berries in the forest. The children were always thin. Punishments at Ridgefield varied depending on the perceived offense. Talking back to Talbot might earn a slap or a few lashes. Running away, or trying to, meant a severe whipping and sometimes being sold. Stealing food could result in anything from extra work to physical punishment. The punishments were arbitrary, unpredictable, designed to keep people off balance and afraid. But through all of this, families stayed together. That was the unspoken agreement. Work hard, don't cause trouble, and your children would sleep in the same cabin with you. Your husband or wife would be there when you came in from the fields. Your parents would grow old in the same place where you'd been born. It wasn't freedom, but it was something. A small, fragile something that people clung to because it was all they had. Then, in March of 1826, James Grantham's finances began to collapse, and that fragile stability shattered like glass. The trouble started with cotton prices. In 1825, cotton had sold for 14 cents a pound at the New Orleans market. By early 1826, the price had dropped to 9 cents, and it kept falling. James Grantham had borrowed money to expand his operations in 1824, anticipating continued high prices. He'd purchased new land, new equipment, and 4 additional enslaved people from an estate sale near Shreveport. When the cotton market collapsed, he found himself overextended and unable to meet his debt payments. Making matters worse, Grantham had invested $2,000 in a cotton mill near Alexandria, a joint venture with several other planters who'd believed they could profit by processing cotton locally rather than shipping it raw to New Orleans. The mill had opened in 1824 with great fanfare. By 1826 it was bankrupt. Poor management, insufficient capital, and competition from larger mills had killed it. Grantham lost his entire investment. By late spring 1826, James Grantham owed money to the Bank of New Orleans, to several local merchants, and to a cotton factor in Natchitoches who'd advanced him credit against his expected harvest. The total debt was somewhere around $6,000, not an enormous sum by plantation standards, but enough to put Ridgefield in serious jeopardy. Grantham's creditors were starting to make noise. Letters arrived weekly demanding payment. There was talk of lawsuits, of foreclosure. Catherine Grantham pleaded with her husband to sell land. Better to operate a smaller plantation with no debt than to risk losing everything. But James was stubborn. He'd inherited 400 acres from his father, and he was determined to pass at least that much to his own son. Selling land felt like admitting defeat, like betraying his father's legacy, so he decided to sell people instead. Word spread through the parish in May that Grantham was liquidating some of his assets. Neighbors assumed he'd sell equipment, maybe some livestock. A few anticipated he might sell 1 or 2 troublesome slaves. No one expected what actually happened. On June 6, 1826, a slave trader named Cyrus Webb arrived at Ridgefield. Webb was known throughout northern Louisiana and eastern Texas as a dealer in enslaved people. He traveled with a wagon, heavy chains, and 2 assistants who served as enforcers. Webb was in his early 50s, a heavy-set man with graying hair and cold eyes. He'd been in the trade for more than 20 years and had a reputation for efficiency and ruthlessness. He didn't haggle much. He assessed people quickly, made an offer, and moved on if the seller didn't accept. Webb arrived early in the morning, before the day's work had begun. He met with James Grantham in the main house while Talbot assembled the enslaved people in the yard. Everyone knew something bad was about to happen. You didn't summon a slave trader unless you were planning to sell. The assembled community stood in the June heat, watching the main house, waiting. Children clung to their parents. Husbands stood close to wives. Aunt Bess murmured prayers. Elias, standing near the back, watched everything with his careful, observant gaze. After about an hour, Grantham and Webb emerged from the house. Webb walked slowly along the line of people, examining them the way you'd examine livestock. He checked teeth, felt muscles, asked ages. He was looking for prime workers, people in their 20s and 30s, healthy, strong. He ignored the very old and the very young, unless they came as part of a family unit. Webb made his selections quickly. He pointed to 7 people. They were not random choices. They were 3 complete families. The first family was Dinah, her husband Thomas, and their 2 young daughters Clara and Bess. Dinah was 28 years old, a field worker who was known for her endurance and her quiet dignity. Thomas was 32, tall and strong, one of the most productive workers on the plantation. Clara was 7, Bess was 5. The girls had been helping their mother in the garden plots, learning to cook and sew, doing the work that children did. The second family was Big Jack, his wife Mary, and their infant son, who didn't have a name yet because he was only 3 months old, and names were sometimes delayed until you knew a child would survive infancy. Big Jack was 26 years old and lived up to his name. He was over 6 feet tall, powerfully built, capable of work that would break smaller men. Mary was 24, still recovering from childbirth, exhausted and frightened. The third was Ruth and her teenage son Peter. Ruth was 35, a woman who'd already survived more than most. She'd been separated from her first husband years earlier, sold to Ridgefield from a plantation near Natchez. Peter was 14, on the cusp of becoming a valuable field hand. He was small for his age, but wiry and quick. When Webb pointed to these 7 people, the rest of the community understood immediately that entire families were being destroyed. This wasn't the sale of an individual troublemaker or a surplus worker. This was something different. This was arbitrary, calculated purely by market value. Dinah started to cry. She didn't make much noise. Crying loudly was dangerous, but tears ran down her face. Thomas put his arm around her and pulled the girls close. Mary clutched her baby and looked at Big Jack with an expression of pure terror. Peter grabbed his mother's hand. Ruth stood very still, her face blank, retreating into some internal place where the horror couldn't reach her. The rest of the community stood frozen. They wanted to do something, say something, but there was nothing to be done. Speaking out would only make things worse, might result in more people being sold, might get someone killed. So they stood in silence and watched as Webb approached the families he'd selected. Webb gave James Grantham his offer. He would pay $47 each for Dinah and Thomas, $22 each for the girls, $60 for Big Jack, $35 for Mary, $12 for the infant, $40 for Ruth, $35 for Peter. The total came to $335. It was insultingly low. At market rates, these 7 people were worth at least $500, probably more. But Webb knew Grantham was desperate, and desperate sellers didn't negotiate. Grantham accepted. Money changed hands. Webb's assistants brought out the chains. The children screamed when they saw the chains. Clara broke away from her mother and ran, but one of Webb's assistants caught her before she'd gotten 10 feet. He carried her back, kicking and crying, and held her while Webb shackled Dinah and Thomas together at the wrists. The girls weren't chained, but they were kept close. Big Jack was shackled at the ankles and wrists. Webb wasn't taking chances with a man that size. Mary was left unchained because she was carrying the baby, but she was positioned between the 2 assistants. Peter was shackled to his mother. The entire process took less than 30 minutes. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the 7 people were loaded into Webb's wagon. Their possessions, what few they had, were left behind. There was no time to say goodbye to anyone, no opportunity for final words. Webb wanted to move quickly. The longer you stayed, the more chances for trouble. As the wagon pulled away, the remaining enslaved community at Ridgefield stood in the yard and watched. Some people were crying openly now. Others stood in shocked silence. The children didn't understand what was happening, only that Clara and Bess were leaving, and they might never see them again. The wagon moved down the long dirt road that led away from the plantation, past the cotton fields, past the oak trees, until it disappeared around a bend and was gone. And with it went Dinah, Thomas, Clara, Bess, Big Jack, Mary, their baby, Ruth, and Peter. They were heading south toward Opelousas, the first stop on a journey that would scatter them across Louisiana. In the cabins that night, the community was shattered. People who'd lost family members sat in silence or wept quietly. The cabin that Dinah and Thomas had shared with their daughters was empty. The one that Big Jack, Mary, and the baby had occupied was empty. Ruth and Peter's space in a shared cabin was vacant. Those empty spaces felt like wounds, like pieces had been cut out of the community's body. Elias sat by his fire and thought about what had happened. He was 48 years old, born at Ridgefield, and he'd seen people sold before, but never entire families at once. Never arbitrary selections driven purely by financial pressure. And he understood, with the cold clarity that comes from experience, that this could happen again. Grantham's financial problems hadn't been solved by selling 7 people for $335. If anything, accepting such a low price suggested that the problems were worse than anyone knew. Other families could be sold. Any family. His own children were grown and working in the fields. They could be next. That night, Elias made a decision. Someone needed to know what happened to Dinah, to Thomas, to all of them. Someone needed to remember, because if no one remembered, if no one kept track, it was as if they'd never existed at all. But Elias couldn't write. He'd never been taught. Literacy was illegal for enslaved people in Louisiana, punishable by whipping or worse. But Elias knew someone who could write. There was a boy, 11 years old, who worked in the main house. His name was Benjamin. He was small for his age, quiet, observant. And Elias had noticed over the past year that Benjamin could read. He'd seen the boy looking at newspapers when he thought no one was watching. He'd seen him trace his finger across words, his lips moving silently. The next day, Elias approached Benjamin when no one else was nearby. He was direct. "You can read, can't you?" Benjamin went very still. Being caught with literacy could mean being sold or beaten. "I don't know what—" "I'm not going to tell anyone," Elias said quietly. "But I need your help. Can you write?" Benjamin hesitated, then nodded. "I need you to write something down for me," Elias said, "about the people who were sold, where they went, what happened to them." Benjamin looked confused. "How would we know what happened to them?" "We'll find out," Elias said. "I'll find out. You just need to write it down." And that's how the diary began. Benjamin didn't have a journal, so he improvised. He found a partially used ledger book in James Grantham's study, one that had been abandoned after a few pages because Grantham had made an accounting error and started fresh in a new book. Benjamin stole it. It wasn't difficult. He worked in the house, cleaned the study, and had access to things that other people didn't. He hid the ledger under his mattress in the small room behind the kitchen where he slept with 2 other house servants. The first entries were written on June 8, 1826, just 2 days after the sale. Benjamin wrote in small, careful handwriting, conscious of wasting space. Elias dictated what he knew. June 8, 1826. Dinah, Thomas, 2 daughters, Clara, age 7, and Bess, age 5, sold to trader named Cyrus Webb. Took them south toward Opelousas. Webb said something about rice work but wasn't clear. $47 each for Dinah and Thomas, $22 for the children. Big Jack, wife Mary, infant son no name, same buyer, same direction. Webb mentioned a buyer near Lafayette might be interested. $60 for Jack, $35 for Mary, $12 for the child. Ruth, age 35, and son Peter, age 14, purchased separate from the others. Peter sent to a brickyard in Baton Rouge, according to what Mr. Grantham said to Mrs. Grantham at dinner. Ruth sent north, destination unclear. The handwriting was shaky. Benjamin was terrified of being caught. But he wrote it down, and Elias felt something like relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. The information existed now. It had been recorded. But the entries were incomplete. They didn't say where the families actually ended up, only where they'd been taken initially. To make the diary useful, Elias needed more information. He needed to know what happened after Webb's wagon disappeared down the road. So Elias started asking questions. He began carefully, indirectly. When enslaved people from other plantations came to Ridgefield, which happened occasionally when neighbors borrowed workers, or when people were hired out temporarily, Elias would ask if they'd heard anything about a trader named Cyrus Webb. Had anyone seen him recently? Did anyone know where he sold people? Most people didn't know anything. But one man, visiting from a plantation near St. Landry, mentioned that Webb had a reputation for selling to rice plantations along the Gulf Coast. Another woman from a property closer to Lafayette said Webb worked with a buyer named Deschamps, who operated several sugar estates. Elias collected these scraps of information like a crow collecting shiny objects. Each piece by itself meant nothing, but together they began to form a picture. There was also Talbot, the overseer. Talbot received newspapers occasionally, usually weeks out of date, and he would leave them in the main house when he was done. Benjamin, working in the house, had access to those newspapers, and sometimes in the back pages there were advertisements, notices of slave sales, auctions, estate liquidations. Benjamin started reading those advertisements carefully, looking for names. In late July 1826, Benjamin found something. An advertisement from a plantation called Bellevue, located near Houma, about 80 miles south of Ridgefield. The ad was selling rice land and mentioned a complement of prime field hands recently acquired. It didn't list names, but the timing was right. Webb had headed south toward Opelousas and Lafayette. Houma was in that general direction. Elias couldn't be sure, but it was possible. He told Benjamin to write it down as a possibility. July 28, 1826. Possible location for Dinah and family, Bellevue Plantation near Houma. Advertisement mentions recent acquisition of field hands, no confirmation. It was frustrating. Elias wanted certainty, not possibilities. But certainty was impossible. Enslaved people didn't have the freedom to travel, to investigate, to send letters. Information came in fragments, rumors, overheard conversations. You had to piece it together like a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Then, in August, something extraordinary happened, something that changed everything. A letter arrived at Ridgefield. It was unusual for several reasons. First, it was addressed not to James Grantham, but to the house servants at Ridgefield Plantation. Second, it had been left near the cabins, not delivered to the main house. Third, no one knew who had delivered it. It had simply appeared one morning tucked into the doorframe of one of the cabins. A woman named Rose found it. She couldn't read, so she brought it to Benjamin. Benjamin opened it carefully, his hands shaking. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a few lines written in shaky, barely legible handwriting. We are near the coast. The work is rice and it is killing work. Thomas is sick with the fever. They have separated the girls. Clara and Bess are in the main house now doing kitchen work. I do not think we will see Ridgefield again. Tell Elias I remember. Tell everyone I remember. Dinah. Benjamin read the letter aloud to Rose, then to Elias, then to a small group of people who gathered in one of the cabins that evening. The reaction was a mixture of grief and astonishment. Dinah was alive. She'd found a way to send word. And she'd confirmed what Elias had suspected. She was at a rice plantation near the coast, which fit with Bellevue. The girls had been separated from their parents, put to work in the house. Thomas was sick. But the most important part was this. Dinah had found a way to communicate. Somehow, despite the distance, despite the laws, despite everything designed to keep enslaved people isolated and voiceless, she'd gotten a letter back to Ridgefield. Elias understood immediately what this meant. If Dinah could send a letter, others might be able to as well. Information could flow. The network could extend beyond Ridgefield. But how had she done it? The letter didn't say, and Elias didn't know how to find out. The answer came 2 weeks later, when a free black man named Daniel Hart arrived at Ridgefield to do some carpentry work. Hart was hired by James Grantham to repair some of the cabins before winter. He was in his mid-30s, quiet, skilled at his trade. He'd been born free. His mother had been manumitted by her master before Daniel was born, and he worked throughout Natchitoches parish doing odd jobs. Elias watched Hart work for 2 days before approaching him. He waited until Hart was alone, working on a cabin at the far end of the row, away from where Talbot could see. "Did you bring a letter here?" Elias asked quietly. Hart looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." "From a woman named Dinah," Elias said, "from down near Houma." Hart set down his hammer. He studied Elias for a long moment, assessing whether he could be trusted. Finally he said, "Maybe." "How did you get it?" Elias asked. Hart hesitated. Then he said, "There's a network. People who carry messages. Free black folks mostly. Some white folks who can be trusted, not many. We move around for work. Carpentry, blacksmithing, selling goods. We hear things. We carry things. Letters, sometimes. Information." Elias felt something unfold in his chest. Hope, maybe. Or something like it. "Could you carry information for me? About the people who were sold from here?" Hart considered this. "What kind of information? Where they are? What's happening to them, if they're alive?" "Why?" Hart asked. "Because someone needs to remember," Elias said. "Because they want us to forget. But if someone remembers, if someone keeps track, then they existed. They mattered." Hart looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. "I'll ask around. I can't promise anything, but I'll ask." And he did. Over the next 6 months, Daniel Hart became a crucial part of what would eventually grow into an extensive network of information. Hart traveled regularly between Natchitoches, Alexandria, and Opelousas for work. He knew other free black people who traveled different routes, down to New Orleans, across to Texas, north toward Arkansas. They communicated carefully, trading information along with goods and services. Through this network, pieces of information began to trickle back to Ridgefield. A carpenter in Houma confirmed that Dinah, Thomas, and their daughters were at Bellevue Plantation. A blacksmith in Lafayette reported seeing a man matching Big Jack's description working at a sugar estate called Petit Bois. A peddler who traveled between New Orleans and Baton Rouge brought news that a boy named Peter had died at a brickyard. Fever, they said, though it could have been exhaustion or injury. The brickyard was notorious for working people to death. Each piece of information Elias relayed to Benjamin, and Benjamin wrote it down. September 15, 1826, confirmed. Dinah, Thomas, and daughters at Bellevue Plantation near Houma. Rice work. Thomas ill with recurring fever. Girls working in the main house. October 3, 1826. Possible location for Big Jack and family. Petit Bois Sugar Estate near Lafayette. Cannot confirm. October 20th, 1826. Peter, Ruth's son, deceased. Baton Rouge Brickyard, summer 1826. Cause believed to be fever but not certain. November 1st, 1826. Ruth's location still unknown. Inquiries ongoing. The diary was growing. The handwriting remained small and precise. Benjamin was careful to use space efficiently, knowing that the ledger was finite. He wrote in the evenings by candlelight in the small room where he slept. If anyone asked what he was doing, he said he was practicing his letters. A dangerous admission in itself, but less dangerous than admitting he was keeping a record of enslaved people sold from the plantation. By the end of 1826, the diary had expanded to 5 pages. It contained entries about the original 7 people sold in June, plus follow-up information as it became available. Elias checked it regularly, reading over Benjamin's shoulder, making sure everything was recorded accurately. But then, December brought new horror. Thomas died. The news came through Daniel Hart, who'd heard it from a carpenter working in Houma. Thomas had succumbed to the fever that had been weakening him since summer. The rice fields were brutal, standing in water for hours, the sun beating down, the mosquitoes swarming. Fevers were common. Many people didn't survive the first year. Benjamin wrote it down. December 18th, 1826, Thomas deceased, Bellevue Plantation, fever, Dinah and daughters remain. When Elias read the entry, he felt something break inside him. He'd known Thomas. They'd worked together for years. Thomas had been strong, capable, a good father. And now he was dead, gone, because James Grantham had needed $335. Elias went to the cabin that night and told the others. The community mourned quietly. There was no funeral, no marker, no way to honor Thomas's life publicly. But in the cabins, people spoke his name. They remembered him, and Benjamin's diary ensured that someone, somewhere, would always know what had happened to him. That winter, Elias made a decision. This work, the tracking, the remembering, the recording, was too important to stop. If he was sold, if Benjamin was sold, someone else needed to be ready to continue it. The diary had to survive, even if they didn't. So Elias began training others. He identified people in the community who could be trusted, who understood the importance of memory, who wouldn't betray the secret if they were questioned or tortured. He taught them how to gather information, how to ask questions without drawing attention, how to recognize names and places. He made them memorize the names in the diary, so that even if the physical book was destroyed, the information would survive in human memory. And Benjamin, for his part, began teaching another child to read and write, a girl named Iris, who was 6 years old and worked in the main house alongside her mother. Benjamin taught her slowly, carefully, over the course of months. He showed her letters, taught her to sound out words, made her practice writing on scraps of paper that they burned afterward to eliminate evidence. Iris was quick. Within a year, she could read simple texts and write in a clear, if somewhat shaky, hand. Benjamin told her about the diary, explained its purpose, made her understand why it mattered. Iris listened with the seriousness of a child who'd grown up understanding that the world was dangerous and arbitrary. By the time 1827 ended, the foundation had been laid. The diary existed. The network existed. The information was flowing. And multiple people were trained to continue the work if the original keepers were sold or killed. What none of them knew was how long this would last, how far it would extend, or how many names would eventually fill the diary's pages. But they knew it mattered. They knew someone needed to bear witness. And so they continued, in secret, in fear, documenting the thing that everyone else wanted to forget. By 1828, the diary had become more than just a record of the families sold in 1826. It had expanded to include any person sold from Ridgefield, and gradually it began including information about people sold from neighboring plantations as well. The network that Daniel Hart had helped establish was growing, extending across northern and central Louisiana like an invisible web. James Grantham's financial troubles had not improved. The cotton market remained depressed through 1827 and into 1828. Grantham had managed to avoid bankruptcy, but only by selling more people. In August 1827, he sold 3 individuals, a young man named Marcus, a woman named Hannah, and an older man named Joseph. In March 1828, he sold 2 more, a woman named Sarah and her teenage daughter June. Each sale was recorded in the diary. Benjamin wrote down everything Elias told him, everything they learned through the network. August 11, 1827, Marcus, age 24, sold to trader Wallace. Destination, Mobile, Alabama. Price, $53. August 11, 1827, Hannah, age 31, sold to trader Wallace. Same destination. Price, $48. Hannah has 2 children who remain at Ridgefield. Children are George, age 9, and little Bess, age 6. August 11, 1827, Joseph, age 58, sold to trader Wallace. Destination unclear. Price, $20. Low value due to age. March 7, 1828, Sarah, age 42, and daughter June, age 15, sold together to buyer from Vicksburg. Buyer name, Cornelius Pike. Price, $85 total. The separation of Hannah from her children was particularly devastating. George and little Bess were left at Ridgefield with no parents, no immediate family. They were absorbed into other families' cabins, but they were orphans in every way that mattered. George became quiet, withdrawn. Little Bess cried every night for months. Elias made sure their story was recorded. Benjamin wrote it down with particular care. Hannah's children, George and Bess, remain at Ridgefield without mother or father. Mother sold away August 1827. Father died 1824. Children currently living with Rose. The network continued to expand. Daniel Hart remained the primary connection, but others joined. A free black woman named Celeste, who sold vegetables and poultry throughout the parish, became a carrier of information. A white peddler named Murphy, who was sympathetic to the abolitionist cause, though he never said so openly, occasionally passed along news he heard in his travels. An enslaved blacksmith named Samuel, who was hired out to different plantations and moved around the region, became an observer and listener. Through these connections, information flowed back to Ridgefield. By late 1828, the diary contained updates on most of the people who'd been sold. November 1828. Dinah and daughters still at Bellevue. Daughters now age 9 and 7. Working in-house. Dinah in fields. No news of remarriage or additional children. November 1828. Big Jack seen by traveler at Petit Bois estate near Lafayette. Still alive. Wife Mary believed to have been sold again. Destination unknown. Infant son's fate unknown. Presumed deceased. November 1828. Ruth located in Natchez, working as house servant for family named Prescott, reportedly in poor health. November 1828. Marcus confirmed in Mobile, working on docks. No additional information. November 1828. Hannah. No confirmation of location beyond initial sale to Mobile area. November 1828. Joseph deceased. Date and location unknown. Some entries were confirmations, others were rumors, some were gaps, people who'd vanished into the system so completely that no information could be found. But Benjamin recorded everything, and Elias continued gathering information relentlessly. The work was dangerous. In 1829, Louisiana passed stricter laws regarding enslaved people and literacy. The penalties for teaching an enslaved person to read or write were increased. Patrols were enhanced. The atmosphere became more paranoid, more restrictive, but the diary continued. In April 1829, Ruth died. The news came through Samuel the blacksmith, who'd been working in Natchez and heard about it from another enslaved person. Ruth had been ill for months, some kind of wasting disease, people said, and she'd finally succumbed. She was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on the Prescott property. No one knew exactly where. No marker, no ceremony, nothing to indicate that a woman named Ruth had lived and worked and suffered and died there. But the diary knew. Benjamin recorded it. April 1829. Ruth deceased in Natchez. Illness, nature unknown. Age approximately 38. Son, Peter predeceased her, 1826. No other known children. Elias was now 51 years old. He'd been at Ridgefield his entire life. He'd buried his wife 6 years earlier, lost to fever during a particularly bad summer. His 2 adult children still worked at Ridgefield, a son named Jacob who worked in the fields, and a daughter named Patience who worked in the main house. He had grandchildren now, 3 of them, ranging in age from infant to 6 years old. And he lived with the constant fear that any of them could be sold at any moment. That fear was realized in 1830. In June of that year, James Grantham sold 12 people. It was the largest sale since the plantation had been founded. The reason was simple. Grantham was nearly bankrupt. The cotton market had recovered slightly, but not enough to offset his accumulated debts. His creditors were threatening legal action. He had no choice. Cyrus Webb returned, along with another trader named Foster. They spent 2 days at Ridgefield, examining people, making selections. When they were done, 12 people, nearly a third of the remaining enslaved population, were chained and loaded onto wagons. Among the 12 was Jacob, Elias's son. Elias tried to intervene. He went to James Grantham directly, something that was dangerous for an enslaved person to do. He asked Grantham to reconsider, to sell someone else, to keep families together. Grantham refused. Jacob was in his prime, 26 years old, strong and healthy. He would bring a good price. That was all that mattered. Jacob was sold to a buyer in Texas. The trader Foster specialized in the Texas market, where cotton plantations were expanding rapidly and labor was in high demand. Jacob was chained to 3 other men and taken west. The journey would take weeks, maybe longer. The conditions would be brutal. Elias watched his son leave. Jacob looked back once as the wagon pulled away, his face a mask of grief and rage. Then he was gone, disappearing down the same road that Dinah and Thomas and so many others had traveled before him. That night, Elias sat with Benjamin and dictated the entry. His voice was flat, emotionless. If he let himself feel the full weight of what had happened, he would break. So he retreated into facts, into documentation, into the work of remembering. June 14th, 1830. Jacob, age 26, sold to trader Foster. Destination: Texas, specific location unknown. Price: $72. Jacob is son of Elias. Left behind wife Marie and 3 children ages 6, 4, and infant. Benjamin wrote it down. His own hand was shaking. He was 16 now, still working in the main house, still keeping the diary in secret. He understood that he could be next. Anyone could be next. The other 11 people sold that day were recorded as well. Their names, ages, prices, destinations. Benjamin filled 2 full pages with the entries. It was the darkest day in Ridgefield's history, and the diary bore witness. In the aftermath of the sale, the remaining community was devastated. Marie, Jacob's wife, stopped speaking. She withdrew into silence, caring for her children mechanically, as if she were moving through a dream. The cabins felt empty, even though people still lived in them. The social structure that had held the community together was fracturing, but Elias didn't stop. If anything, he became more determined. The pain of losing Jacob was unbearable, but the thought of Jacob being forgotten was worse. The diary became Elias's way of fighting back against the erasure, against the system that treated people as commodities, and the network kept growing. By 1832, the network extended from Texas to Mississippi, from Arkansas to the Gulf Coast. Free black people, sympathetic whites, enslaved people who traveled for various reasons, they all became part of an informal information system that tracked the movement of people through the domestic slave trade. The information was never perfect. Sometimes rumors turned out to be false. Sometimes people couldn't be located. Sometimes the information came too late. Someone had died, and the news took months to reach Ridgefield. But the network persisted, and the diary grew. March 1832, Jacob last confirmed in Austin, Texas, working on cotton plantation owned by someone named Patterson. Alive as of late 1831. March 1832, Big Jack deceased, Petit Bois Estate, Louisiana. Date unknown, sometime in 1831, cause unknown. Wife Mary and infant son never located after initial sale. March 1832. Dinah's daughter Clara, now age 13, sold separately from mother and sister. Sent to New Orleans, sold to household there. Family name believed to be Devereaux. Dinah and younger daughter Bess remain at Bellevue. Each entry was a small tragedy. Each name represented a life disrupted, a family destroyed, a person reduced to property and scattered across the South like seeds thrown to the wind. But the diary gave them permanence. It said, "You existed. You were here. You were loved. You were lost. Someone remembers." In 1834, Elias was sold. He was 56 years old, considered old for an enslaved person, but still capable of work. James Grantham sold him to a plantation near St. Francisville for $38. It was a small price, but Grantham needed every dollar he could get. The community at Ridgefield gathered to say goodbye. Elias had been there his entire life. He'd seen generations born and die. He'd kept the memory alive. And now, he was leaving. Before he left, Elias spoke to Benjamin one last time. They met in the cabin away from Talbot's eyes. "You have to continue," Elias said. "Even without me. The diary has to survive." "I will," Benjamin said. I promise. And if you're sold? Elias asked. Benjamin looked at him. I've been teaching Iris. She's 14 now. She can read and write better than I can. She knows about the diary. She knows why it matters. Elias nodded. Good. Make sure she's ready. And make sure someone else is ready too. There always has to be someone. There will be, Benjamin promised. The next morning, Elias was taken away. He looked back at Ridgefield as the wagon carried him north, memorizing the place where he'd spent his entire life. He thought about his son Jacob somewhere in Texas. He thought about his daughter Patience, who would remain at Ridgefield with her children. He thought about all the people who'd been sold, whose names were written in the diary. And he thought, someone will remember. Someone will know what happened. At St. Francisville, Elias was put to work in the fields at a plantation called Ashland. The work was hard, but no harder than what he'd done at Ridgefield. He kept his head down, worked without complaint, and listened. He listened for news, for information, for anything that might flow back through the network to the diary. And back at Ridgefield, Benjamin continued the work. He added a new entry. March 22, 1834. Elias, age 56, sold to Ashland Plantation, St. Francisville. Price, $38. Elias arrived in good health. He is father of Jacob, sold 1830, and Patience remains at Ridgefield. He is grandfather of 5. He began this diary. The handwriting was the same, small, precise, careful, but there was something different about this entry. Benjamin had added a detail that he usually didn't include. He began this diary. It was an acknowledgement, a tribute. Elias had started this work out of grief and determination, and now that work would continue without him. The diary had survived its first transition, but it wouldn't be the last. Benjamin was 20 years old in 1834. He'd been keeping the diary for 8 years since he was 12. In that time, he'd documented the sale of 43 people from Ridgefield, tracked their movements across 7 states, and recorded 16 deaths. The leather-bound ledger was more than half full now, its pages covered in his small, meticulous handwriting. Working in the main house gave Benjamin access that other enslaved people didn't have. He cleaned James Grantham's study, which meant he could read Grantham's correspondence, his business ledgers, his contracts with slave traders. He carried messages between Grantham and neighbors, which meant he heard conversations, picked up information, learned the names of traders and buyers. And he was trusted. A dangerous thing because trust meant visibility, and visibility meant risk, but necessary for the work. Iris, 14 in 1834, was learning quickly. She'd been working alongside Benjamin in the main house for 2 years, and she'd absorbed everything he'd taught her. She could read almost as well as Benjamin now, and her handwriting, while less practiced, was clear and legible. Benjamin had shown her the diary, explained its history, made her understand its importance. "Why do we do this?" Iris asked one evening. They were alone in the small room behind the kitchen, the diary open between them. "Because they want us to forget," Benjamin said. "Every person who sold, they want it to be like that person never existed. But if we write it down, if we keep the record, then they can't make us forget. The people are remembered. They mattered." Iris looked at the pages filled with names, dates, locations. "What happens if we're caught?" "We'll be sold," Benjamin said. "Maybe worse. But the diary will still exist. Someone else will keep it going." "How do you know?" Iris asked. "Because it has to," Benjamin said simply. "It's bigger than us now." In 1835, James Grantham died. He was 53 years old, worn down by financial stress and, some said, excessive drinking. He suffered some kind of seizure while working in his study and was dead before anyone could help him. His wife, Catherine, sent for a doctor, but there was nothing to be done. The death threw Ridgefield into uncertainty. William Grantham, James's eldest son, was only 14. Catherine would manage the plantation until William came of age, but in the meantime, everything was in flux. Would she continue operating Ridgefield? Would she sell it? Would she sell more people to stabilize the finances? The enslaved community waited in dread. Transitions were dangerous. New owners meant new rules. new cruelties, new risks of being sold. But Catherine, it turned out, was more financially astute than her late husband. She hired a competent overseer to replace Talbot, who'd left to work at another plantation, renegotiated some of James's debts, and sold off equipment and land rather than people. For the next several years, no one was sold from Ridgefield. It was a reprieve, fragile and temporary, but welcome. Benjamin used the relative stability to strengthen the network. Daniel Hart was still traveling through the region, still carrying information. Celeste, the vegetable seller, continued her work, and new people joined the network. A free black preacher named Reverend Cross, who traveled between towns holding services. A white abolitionist doctor named Calloway, who treated enslaved people and passed along information quietly. A woman named Esther, who worked as a seamstress and moved between plantations for work. Through these connections, the diary continued to grow. Benjamin recorded updates on people sold years earlier, documented their survival or death, tracked their movements through the endless churning of the domestic slave trade. July 1836. Jacob, son of Elias, confirmed alive in Texas near Houston, working cotton, remarried to a woman named Nell. One child. July 1836. Dinah still at Bellevue Plantation, now age 38. Younger daughter Bess remains with her, age 15. Older daughter Clara, location unknown after sale to New Orleans in 1832. July 1836. Hannah last seen in Mobile, 1834. No information since. Presumed alive but unconfirmed. July 1836. Elias at Ashland Plantation, St. Francisville, reported to be in declining health. Age now 58. The entry about Elias troubled Benjamin. The information had come through Reverend Cross, who'd visited St. Francisville and spoken with people at Ashland. Elias was aging, his strength failing. Benjamin added a note in the margin. Founder of this record must preserve his story. In 1838, Catherine Grantham began selling people again. The reprieve was over. The plantation's finances had stabilized but not recovered. Catherine needed capital to make improvements, to purchase new equipment, to keep Ridgefield competitive. So she sold 4 people that year, 3 in 1839, 2 in 1840. Benjamin recorded each sale with the same careful attention he always had. But he noticed something changing in himself. The emotional distance he'd maintained as a child was eroding. These weren't just names in a diary anymore. They were people he knew, people he'd lived alongside, people he cared about. In 1839, a woman named Rose was sold. Rose had been at Ridgefield Benjamin's entire life. She was the woman who'd found Dinah's letter back in 1826, the woman who'd helped raise him, who'd protected him when the work was hard and the overseers cruel. And now she was being sold, sent to Shreveport, separated from everyone she knew. Benjamin wrote the entry with tears in his eyes. May 1839, Rose, age 47, sold to Shreveport. Buyer, estate liquidation auction. Price, $32. Rose has been at Ridgefield since before I was born. She taught me to be careful to survive. I will not forget her. It was the most personal entry Benjamin had ever written. Usually he kept the entries factual, detached. But Rose's sale broke something in him. He realized that he couldn't maintain complete emotional distance. The diary was about people he loved, and writing about them meant confronting the grief of losing them. Iris noticed the change in Benjamin. She saw how the work was wearing on him, how each new sale seemed to take a piece of him. She was 19 now, capable and ready to assume more responsibility. "Let me help more," she said. "You don't have to carry this alone." So they began sharing the work. Benjamin still gathered most of the information, but Iris started writing some of the entries. Her handwriting appeared in the diary for the first time in 1840. March 1840, Samuel, age 32, sold to Memphis. Wife and children remain at Ridgefield. Separation extremely difficult for family. Samuel's wife, Anne, has not spoken since he left. Iris's entries were slightly different from Benjamin's. They included more emotional context, more acknowledgement of the human cost. Benjamin read her entry about Samuel and nodded. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly right. That's what people need to know." The 1840s brought new challenges to the network. As the abolitionist movement grew in the North, the South became more paranoid and restrictive. Laws governing enslaved people were tightened. Patrols increased. Free black people faced new restrictions on their movement. The network that had operated for 15 years began to fray at the edges. Daniel Hart, now in his 50s, could no longer travel as much as he once had. Celeste stopped selling vegetables and focused on her family. Reverend Cross moved north to Arkansas and was outside the network's range. Dr. Calloway died of yellow fever in 1843, but new people joined to replace those lost. A young, free black man named Thomas Riley, who worked as a porter on steamboats traveling the Mississippi River, became a crucial link between Louisiana and Mississippi. An enslaved woman named Martha, who was hired out as a cook and moved between plantations, became an observer and listener. A white merchant named Foster, not the slave trader, a different man, who disapproved of slavery on moral grounds, occasionally passed along information he heard in his business dealings. The network adapted, evolved, survived, and the diary continued. In 1845, tragedy struck. A fire swept through one of the cabins at Ridgefield in the middle of the night. The cause was never determined. Maybe a spark from the fireplace, maybe a candle knocked over, maybe something else. The fire spread quickly. By the time people realized what was happening and woke up, the cabin was engulfed. 3 people died in that fire, a woman named Clara, her teenage son, and her young daughter. They were asleep and likely died of smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. The community buried them in the small graveyard behind the cabins, marked only by wooden crosses that would rot away within a few years. Benjamin recorded the deaths in the diary, noting the date, the circumstances, the names. Then he added something else. These deaths were not from sale or separation, but from the conditions we live in. Cabins with no safety, no protection. We are kept in buildings that would not be used for animals on some plantations. This, too, must be remembered. It was a rare editorial comment. Usually Benjamin kept his writing strictly factual. But the fire, the deaths of 3 people who should have been safe in their beds, triggered something in him. The diary wasn't just about tracking sales. It was about documenting the entire system, the way it killed people through neglect and indifference as much as through violence. Iris read the entry and agreed. "We should record this more," she said. "Not just the sales, everything. The conditions, the illnesses, the things that kill us slowly." So the diary began to include more context. Entries about illness, about malnutrition, about accidents in the fields, about children who died before their first birthday. The scope expanded, and the diary became a more complete record of life and death under slavery. Winter 1846. Multiple cases of pneumonia in the cabins. 3 children deceased, infant son of Marie, infant daughter of Sarah, 4-year-old son of Anne, caused cold weather, inadequate clothing, no proper medicine. Summer 1847, fever outbreak, 5 people seriously ill, 2 deaths, older man named Lewis, age 61, younger woman named Julie, age 24. Dr. Calloway would have helped if he were still alive. No doctor called because Mrs. Grantham says it is too expensive. By 1847, the diary was 2/3 full. Benjamin was 33 years old. Iris was 27. They'd been keeping the record for more than 20 years between them, and the information they'd gathered was staggering. The diary now contained detailed information on 96 people sold from Ridgefield since 1826. Of those 96, 31 were confirmed deceased. 42 were alive at last report, though many of those reports were years out of date. 23 were unaccounted for, lost in the vast machinery of the slave trade. And then, December 1847 brought news that struck Benjamin deeply. Elias had died. The information came through Thomas Riley, the steamboat porter, who'd heard it from someone at Ashland Plantation. Elias had died of fever in early December. He was 69 years old, an extraordinary age for an enslaved person. He'd lived 13 years at Ashland after leaving Ridgefield. Benjamin sat alone with the diary and wrote the entry by candlelight. December 1847. Elias deceased at Ashland Plantation, St. Francisville. Age approximately 69. Cause, fever. Elias was born at Ridgefield and lived there 56 years before being sold in 1834. He had 2 children, Jacob, sold to Texas in 1830, and Patience, who remains here. He had 7 grandchildren. He began this diary in June 1826, after 7 people were sold from Ridgefield. He could not write himself, so he taught me to do it for him. He said someone needed to remember. He said the people mattered. I will continue his work until I cannot, and then someone else will. Elias, you are remembered. It was the longest entry Benjamin had ever written about a single person. It was a eulogy, a tribute, a promise. Iris read it and wiped her eyes. He would be proud of what you've done, she said. Of what we've done, Benjamin corrected. This isn't just me anymore. In 1849, Benjamin's life at Ridgefield ended. William Grantham, now 28 years old and fully in control of the plantation, decided to sell several people to fund improvements he wanted to make. Benjamin was one of them. He was sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi for $65. The sale happened quickly. Benjamin had 2 days' notice. He spent those 2 days preparing Iris to take over completely. He showed her where the diary was hidden, reviewed the network contacts, made her promise to continue the work. What happens to the diary when you leave? Iris asked. It stays here, Benjamin said. It has to stay at Ridgefield. This is where it started. This is where it belongs. If it leaves, it might be discovered, might be destroyed. Here, you can hide it. You know the hiding places. Iris nodded. She was terrified, but she understood. Benjamin wrote one final entry in his own hand before he left. November 1849. Benjamin, age 35, sold to Monroe Plantation, Mississippi. Buyer, agent for a Mr. Hoskins. Price, $65. I have kept this diary since 1826 when I was 11 years old. I have recorded 96 sales, 42 deaths, and countless instances of suffering. I pass this work now to Iris, who will continue. The diary must survive. The people must be remembered. 2 days later, Benjamin was gone. Iris was left alone with the diary and the enormous responsibility it represented. She was 29 years old. She'd been preparing for this moment for years, but now that it was here, she felt the full weight of it. That first night alone, she opened the diary and read through the entries. Page after page of names, dates, locations, lives documented, remembered, preserved. She thought about Elias, who'd started this work, about Benjamin, who'd kept it going, about all the people whose names filled these pages, and she made a promise to herself. She would not let them be forgotten. No matter what it cost her, no matter how long it took, she would continue the work. The diary had survived its second transition, and Iris's handwriting appeared on a new page. November 1849. I am Iris. I am now the keeper of this record. I will continue what Elias began and what Benjamin carried forward. I will remember. Iris's stewardship of the diary coincided with the most turbulent period in American history leading up to the Civil War. The 1850s were marked by escalating political tensions, violent conflicts over slavery's expansion, and a growing sense that the entire system was heading toward collapse. But at Ridgefield, life continued in its grim routine, and people continued to be sold. Iris's entries were different from Benjamin's in subtle but important ways. Where Benjamin had focused on facts and kept emotional distance, at least initially, Iris wrote with more feeling, more context, more acknowledgement of the human cost. Her handwriting was slightly larger, less cramped, taking up more space on the page. February 1851, Carolyn, age 29, and her son James, age 7, sold to New Orleans, separated from husband who remains at Ridgefield. Caroline used to sing in the evenings. Her voice made even the hardest days bearable. James was afraid of the dark and would cry for his mother, and she would hold him and sing until he slept. They are gone now. Her husband Marcus has not spoken since they left. The entry captured not just the bare facts, but the emotional devastation. Iris understood that the diary wasn't just about recording names and dates. It was about preserving the humanity of the people who were being erased. The network continued to function, though it was harder now. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made it more dangerous for free black people to travel, more dangerous to help enslaved people, more dangerous to do anything that might be interpreted as assisting runaways or disrupting the system. Patrols were more aggressive. Punishments were more severe, but people still found ways to pass information. Thomas Riley still worked the steamboats, still carried news up and down the Mississippi. Martha still cooked at different plantations, still listened and remembered. New people joined the network. A free black woman named Josephine, who worked as a midwife and traveled to different plantations to attend births. A white newspaper editor named Collins, who privately sympathized with abolition and occasionally passed along information from his sources. An enslaved man named Henry, who was hired out as a carpenter and moved throughout Natchitoches Parish. Through these connections, Iris continued to gather information and update the diary. April 1852. Benjamin confirmed alive in Mississippi, working at Monroe Plantation. Still healthy as of late 1851. No word on whether he has family there. April 1852. Jacob, son of Elias, last confirmed in Texas 1849. No recent information. He would be approximately 48 years old now if alive. April 1852. Dinah believed to be deceased. Bellevue Plantation near Houma. Date unknown. Sometime between 1849 and 1851. Daughter Bess still at Bellevue, now age 31. Other daughter Clara never located after 1832 sale to New Orleans. The entry about Dinah's death affected Iris deeply. Dinah had been one of the first people sold from Ridgefield when the diary began. Her letter in 1826 had proved that communication was possible, that the network could exist. And now she was gone, dead, after more than 25 years at Bellevue, probably buried in an unmarked grave in the Louisiana marshland. But her name was in the diary. Her story was preserved. Her daughters were accounted for. She would be remembered. In 1853, William Grantham made changes to Ridgefield's operations. He began growing more corn and less cotton, diversifying to reduce risk. He purchased new equipment, and he sold 8 people to fund these changes. Iris documented each sale with careful attention. She noted not just the people who were sold, but the families they left behind, the connections that were severed, the grief that remained. March 1853, Louisa, age 36, sold to Arkansas, left behind husband Henry and 3 children ages 14, 11, and 8. Henry is the carpenter who helps with the network. This sale may affect our ability to gather information. March 1853, Samuel, age 27, sold to Vicksburg, no family at Ridgefield. Samuel was Benjamin's friend. They grew up together. Benjamin would want me to note that Samuel was kind, generous, and deserved better than this. The sale of Henry's wife Louisa was indeed a blow to the network. Henry, devastated by the loss, became less willing to take risks, less active in gathering information. Iris understood. She didn't push him. The diary mattered, but people mattered more. Still, the network adapted. Josephine, the midwife, became more active, compensating for Henry's reduced involvement. A new contact emerged. An enslaved man named Robert, who worked on riverboats and had access to information from up and down the Mississippi and Red Rivers. By 1855, the diary was nearly full. Iris had perhaps 30 pages left in the leather-bound ledger. She began writing smaller, conserving space, knowing that when this book was full, she'd need to find another one somehow. The information in the diary was now extraordinary in its scope. It documented 127 people sold from Ridgefield since 1826. It tracked their movements across 9 states. It recorded 58 confirmed deaths, 42 people confirmed alive at last report, and 27 unaccounted for. It included details about families, children, marriages, separations, illnesses, and deaths. It was, though Iris didn't know it at the time, one of the most comprehensive records of slavery's internal workings ever created by enslaved people themselves. In 1857, William Grantham died. He was only 36 years old. The cause was an accident. He'd been thrown from a horse, struck his head, and never regained consciousness. His wife, Margaret, was left to manage the plantation with their young children. Margaret Grantham was overwhelmed. She knew nothing about running a plantation. Within 6 months, she'd sold off nearly half the enslaved population to reduce the operational complexity and generate cash. 16 people were sold in late 1857 and early 1858. Iris watched as the community she'd known her entire life was torn apart. People who'd lived at Ridgefield for generations were suddenly gone, sold to buyers in Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. Families were separated, children were torn from parents. The cabins emptied, and Iris recorded it all. October 1857, Peter, age 19, sold to Florida. Mother remains at Ridgefield. Peter was born here, has never been off the property, now sent more than 1,000 miles away to a place he can't even imagine. October 1857, Anne, age 41, sold to Texas. Husband Samuel was sold in 1840 to Memphis. 5 children remain at Ridgefield with various families. Anne's children, oldest is 22, youngest is 9. They are orphans now, both parents gone. December 1857, Grace, age 33, and her 3 children, ages 11, 8, and 5, sold to Alabama. Separated from husband who remains at Ridgefield. Husband's name is Michael. He stood in the yard and watched them leave. He did not cry. He did not make a sound. But something broke in him. I could see it. The entries from this period were raw, painful. Iris was no longer trying to maintain emotional distance. She couldn't. The horror was too immediate, too overwhelming. By 1858, the enslaved population at Ridgefield had been reduced to about 18 people. The plantation operated on a smaller scale. Margaret eventually remarried, a man named Vincent Trask, who had some experience managing agricultural properties, and life stabilized somewhat. But the damage was done. The community that had existed at Ridgefield for more than 70 years was gone. The people who remained were fragments, survivors, people who'd lost everyone they loved. Iris was 38 years old now. She'd been keeping the diary for 9 years, continuing the work that Elias had started 32 years earlier. She was tired. The work of remembering, of documenting, of carrying all these names and stories was exhausting. But she didn't stop. The late 1850s brought increasing political turmoil. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 terrified the South. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 prompted secession talk. By early 1861, Louisiana had seceded from the Union, and war seemed inevitable. Iris documented these events in the diary, noting how the political upheaval affected Ridgefield. December 1860. Louisiana has seceded. People are talking about war. What this will mean for us, no one knows. Some say if there's war, we'll be freed. Others say it will only get worse. Vincent Trask talks about moving the remaining people to Texas if federal troops come. We are caught between 2 futures, neither of which we can control. April 1861. War has begun. Fort Sumter fired upon. Mr. Trask has joined the Confederate Army. Mrs. Trask is managing the plantation with an overseer. Everything feels uncertain. The diary was nearly full now. Iris had perhaps 10 pages left. She wrote smaller and smaller, conserving every bit of space. And then, in late 1859, she made a decision. She needed to ensure the diary's survival. If there was a war, if Ridgefield was destroyed or abandoned, the diary couldn't be lost. It was too important. So Iris approached Daniel Hart, who was now in his late 50s and still working as a carpenter, though less frequently. She trusted him. She'd known him her entire life. And she knew he'd helped the network from the beginning. "I need you to keep something safe for me," Iris said. She showed him the diary. Daniel read a few entries, his expression growing more and more somber. Finally, he looked at Iris. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since 1849, Iris said. "But it started in 1826. 3 of us have kept it. It has to survive." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll keep it safe. If war comes, if things get bad, I'll hide it where it won't be found. And when it's safe, I'll get it back to you." Iris felt a wave of relief. "Thank you." Daniel took the diary and hid it in his carpenter's workshop, inside a tool chest with a false bottom. And there it remained for several years, preserved while the world around it descended into chaos. The Civil War devastated Louisiana. Union forces captured New Orleans in 1862, and by 1863, federal troops controlled much of the state. The plantation economy collapsed. Enslaved people escaped by the thousands to Union lines. Confederate soldiers confiscated crops and livestock. The social order that had defined the South for generations was disintegrating. Ridgefield, isolated in northern Louisiana, was less directly affected than plantations near major cities or rivers, but the impact was still severe. Vincent Trask was killed in battle in Tennessee in 1862. Margaret Trask, left alone again, struggled to keep the plantation functioning. The overseer left to join the army. The remaining enslaved people continued working, but the old enforcements, patrols, punishments, the constant threat of being sold, were weakening as the Confederacy itself weakened. In early 1863, Union forces advancing through the region reached Natchitoches Parish. Margaretta Trask, fearing for her safety, fled to relatives in Texas. The main house at Ridgefield was partially looted, then partially burned, whether by retreating Confederates, advancing Federals, or opportunistic locals, no one ever knew. The enslaved people who'd been left behind were suddenly free. Not legally. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't apply to areas under Union control, but practically. There were no overseers, no masters, no one to stop them from leaving. Most did leave. They walked to Natchitoches, where Union troops were organizing refugee camps. Some went north toward Arkansas. A few stayed at Ridgefield, uncertain where else to go. Iris was among those who left. She was 43 years old, freed after a lifetime of enslavement. She walked to Natchitoches with a small group from Ridgefield, carrying only what she could fit in a sack. She wanted to retrieve the diary. It had been hidden with Daniel Hart for more than 3 years. But when she reached Natchitoches, she learned that Daniel had died the previous year. Typhoid, someone said. His workshop had been sold, his possessions scattered. The diary was lost. Iris felt a grief almost as profound as anything she'd experienced under slavery. The diary represented 37 years of work, 3 people's lifetimes, hundreds of names, countless stories. And it was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos of war. But she didn't know what else to do. So she survived. She found work in Natchitoches as a laundress. She lived in a small room in a building that housed other formerly enslaved people. She tried to rebuild some kind of life in a world that was still hostile, still dangerous, still uncertain. The war ended in 1865. Lincoln was assassinated. Reconstruction began. Louisiana was placed under military occupation. The 13th Amendment was ratified, formally ending slavery throughout the United States. Iris was legally free now, but freedom came with hunger, poverty, and the constant threat of violence from former Confederates who resented the new order. The years after the war were, in some ways, nearly as difficult as the years under slavery. She thought often about the diary, about Elias, who'd started it, about Benjamin, who'd kept it for so long, about all the names written in those pages. She wondered if anyone would ever know what they'd done, what they'd preserved. Then, in 1871, something extraordinary happened. Thomas Vickers was 26 years old, a graduate of a small college in Pennsylvania, and determined to become a historian. He'd moved to Louisiana in 1870 to conduct research for a book about the economic history of the Cotton South. He was staying in Alexandria, visiting plantations, interviewing former masters and former slaves, collecting documents. In the spring of 1871, Vickers visited a used furniture shop in Alexandria. He was looking for a desk for his boarding room. The shop owner showed him various pieces, including an old tool chest that he said had come from an estate sale a few years earlier. The chest was well made, solid oak with brass fittings. Vickers purchased it for $3. He brought it back to his room and began organizing his papers inside. A few days later, he noticed that the bottom of the chest seemed shallower inside than outside. He examined it more carefully and discovered a false bottom. Hidden beneath it was a leather-bound ledger. Vickers opened the ledger and began to read. The first entry was dated June 8, 1826. The handwriting was small, precise, difficult to read, but Vickers persevered. By the time he'd finished reading, the sun had set and his candle had burned down to a stub. He was shaken. He'd read hundreds of historical documents, bills of sale, plantation ledgers, correspondence, but he'd never read anything like this. This wasn't written by masters. This was written by enslaved people themselves. It documented their own families, their own losses, their own pain. It was a record kept in secret at enormous risk over nearly 40 years. Vickers read through the diary again, more slowly this time. He began making notes, trying to understand what he was reading. He recognized some of the names mentioned: plantations, towns, slave traders. He cross-referenced dates with historical events he knew about. Everything checked out. The diary appeared to be genuine. Vickers showed the diary to a colleague, a professor named Henry Whitfield, who taught at a seminary in Natchitoches. Whitfield read it and was equally astonished. "Do you know what this is?" Whitfield said. "This is one of the most important historical documents I've ever seen. It's a first-hand account of slavery from the inside, written by enslaved people, kept in secret for decades. This is extraordinary. What should I do with it?" Vickers asked. "Donate it to a historical society," Whitfield said. "Make sure it's preserved, and write about it. Tell people what this is." Vickers agreed. He wrote a brief article about the diary for a regional historical journal, describing where he'd found it and what it contained. Then he donated the diary to the Natchitoches Historical Society in 1872, along with a note explaining its provenance and significance. The Historical Society accepted the donation and catalogued the diary. It was assigned a reference number, placed in a storage room, and largely forgotten. Meanwhile, Iris was still in Natchitoches, still working as a laundress. She was 52 years old now, worn down by hard work and poverty. She didn't know that the diary had been found. She didn't know that it was sitting in an archive just a few miles from where she lived. But in 1873, she heard something that caught her attention. She was delivering laundry to a boarding house when she overheard two men talking. One of them was Thomas Vickers. He was describing a diary he'd found, a record kept by enslaved people documenting the sale of their families. Iris stood very still, listening. Vickers mentioned the Natchitoches Historical Society. He mentioned the dates, 1826 to 1867. He mentioned Ridgefield Plantation. Iris's hand started shaking. She set down the laundry basket and approached the men. "Excuse me," she said. "The diary you're talking about, I need to see it." Vickers looked at her, puzzled. "Why?" "Because I wrote part of it," Iris said. There was a long silence. Then Vickers said, "Come with me." They went to the Historical Society. The clerk, after some searching, retrieved the diary from storage. He handed it to Iris. She opened it with trembling hands. She saw Benjamin's handwriting first, the small, careful letters she remembered so well. She turned pages, seeing entry after entry, names and dates and places. Then she found her own handwriting, starting in 1840. The entries she'd written, the people she'd documented. It was all still there, preserved, remembered. Iris started crying. She couldn't help it. 37 years of work. Hundreds of names. And it had survived. Vickers watched her, fascinated and moved. "You wrote this?" he asked. "Some of it," Iris said. "A man named Benjamin wrote most of it, and before him a man named Elias started it. I finished it." "When did you finish it?" Vickers asked. "I didn't," Iris said. "I had to give it away in 1859 to keep it safe during the war. I thought it was lost." She turned to the last written page. The entries stopped in late 1867, but there were a few blank pages after that. "Can I write in it again?" Iris asked the clerk. The clerk hesitated. It was highly irregular, but there was something about the way Iris held the diary, the reverence in her eyes, that made him agree. "Yes," he said, "but please be careful." Iris sat at a table. Vickers gave her a pen and ink, and she wrote, "June 1873, I am Iris. I kept this diary from 1849 to 1859. I thought it was lost in the war. Today I found it again, preserved in the Natchitoches Historical Society. I am writing now to record the names I still remember. The people who were sold and who survived to see freedom, the people who died before freedom came. We are still here. We are still remembered." And then she began writing names. 23 names. People sold from Ridgefield in the 1850s who she knew had survived the war, who she'd encountered in Natchitoches or heard about through the network that still loosely existed. Names of people who died in the 1860s, whose death she'd learned about after the war. Names of children born after emancipation to parents who'd been sold from Ridgefield decades earlier. She filled 2 pages with names. Then she set down the pen. "That's all I can write," she said. "The rest are gone, lost. I don't know what happened to them." Vickers looked at the new entries. Then he looked at Iris. "Will you tell me about this?" he asked. "About how it was kept? About why?" "Yes," Iris said. "I'll tell you everything." And she did. Iris spent the next 3 hours telling Thomas Vickers everything she knew about the diary. She told him about Elias, who'd started it in 1826 after watching 7 people sold from Ridgefield. She told him about Benjamin, who'd kept it for 23 years, who'd built the network of informants and carriers that made the diary possible. She told him about herself, about the years she'd spent continuing the work, about the decision to hide the diary with Daniel Hart to keep it safe during the war. She told him about the network, the free black people and occasional sympathetic whites who'd passed information across hundreds of miles, who'd risked their safety to track the movements of enslaved people through the domestic slave trade. She explained how they'd gathered information from bills of sale, from overheard conversations, from letters written in secret, from rumors passed along chains of communication that stretched from Texas to Mississippi to Alabama. Vickers took notes frantically. He understood that he was hearing something extraordinary, not just the story of a diary, but the story of resistance, of memory, of people who'd refused to let their loved ones be erased. "Why did you do it?" Vickers asked. "Why take such risks?" Iris thought for a moment. Then she said, "Because they wanted us to forget. When someone was sold, it was like they never existed. Their name wasn't spoken. Their family wasn't acknowledged. They were just gone. But if we wrote it down, if we remembered, then they couldn't be erased. They existed. They mattered. That's why." Vickers published a longer article about the diary in 1874, this time including information from his conversation with Iris. The article appeared in a regional historical journal and attracted some attention among historians and abolitionists in the North. A few people wrote to Vickers asking for more information, but for the most part, the diary remained obscure. Iris died in 1891. She was 71 years old. She was buried in a cemetery in Natchitoches that served the black community. Her grave was marked with a simple wooden cross that rotted away within a decade. By the time the 20th century began, no one remembered where exactly she was buried, but her handwriting was in the diary. Her work was preserved. The diary remained in the Natchitoches Historical Society's archives for more than a century. A Occasionally, a historian would come across it while researching something else. Most spent little time with it. The handwriting was difficult, the entries cryptic, and it seemed like just another plantation record among thousands. Then, in 1983, a graduate student named Evelyn Boudreau was researching family structures under slavery for her doctoral dissertation. She was at the Natchitoches Historical Society, going through unprocessed documents when she found the diary. She started reading and immediately realized she'd found something extraordinary. Evelyn spent the next 2 years with the diary. She transcribed every entry, a painstaking process because of the small handwriting and faded ink. She cross-referenced names with census records, plantation ledgers, bills of sale, death certificates, church records, anything she could find. She confirmed that the people named in the diary had existed. The sales had happened. The dates were accurate. The destinations matched bills of sale she found in other archives. The diary was genuine. It was a real record kept by enslaved people over nearly 40 years. Evelyn also tried to trace the network that had made the diary possible. She found references to Daniel Hart in land records and death certificates. She found mentions of Thomas Riley in steamboat manifests. She found a will from Reverend Cross that mentioned his work among enslaved people in Louisiana and Arkansas. Piece by piece, she confirmed that the network had existed, that it had functioned across state lines for decades. She published her findings in 1986 in the Journal of Southern History. The article, titled "The Ridgefield Diary, Enslaved People's Documentary Resistance in Antebellum, Louisiana," became one of the most cited works in slavery studies. It demonstrated that enslaved people hadn't been passive victims, but had actively resisted their erasure through documentation and memory keeping. The diary became known in academic circles as one of the most important primary sources on slavery's lived experience. It was referenced in dozens of books, hundreds of articles, countless dissertations. Scholars used it to understand family separation, the domestic slave trade, the networks of resistance that existed within slavery, the ways that enslaved people maintained their humanity despite systematic dehumanization. But the diary never became widely known outside academic circles. The Natchitoches Historical Society doesn't have the resources for major exhibitions. The diary is fragile, kept in a climate-controlled vault, rarely displayed. Most people who visit the Historical Society don't know it exists. In 2003, the Historical Society digitized the diary. High-resolution scans were made of every page. The digital version is available to researchers upon request, though few know to ask for it. Evelyn Boudreau, now a professor emerita at Tulane University, still studies the diary. In a 2015 interview, she said, "The Ridgefield Diary changes how we understand slavery. It proves that enslaved people weren't just enduring, they were documenting, they were bearing witness. They were ensuring that the people they loved wouldn't be forgotten. That's an act of profound resistance and profound love." The diary contains 173 names of people sold from Ridgefield between 1826 and 1858. It documents 64 confirmed deaths. It tracks people across 11 states. It includes entries about 3 generations of enslaved people. And it preserves the names of 3 people who kept it. Elias, who couldn't write but knew someone needed to remember. Benjamin, who risked everything to continue the work for 23 years. And Iris, who carried it forward and ensured it survived. The diary's last entry, written by Iris in 1873, ends with a simple statement: "We are still here. We are still remembered." The Ridgefield Diary exists because 3 people refused to accept erasure. Elias, Benjamin, and Iris understood that memory is power, that documentation is resistance, that bearing witness is an act of defiance against a system designed to make people disappear. They didn't do it for recognition. They expected to be punished if discovered. They didn't do it for posterity. They had no way of knowing if the diary would survive past their own lifetimes. They did it because it mattered. Because the people who were sold away were human beings who deserved to be remembered. Think about what it took to create this diary. Benjamin learned to read and write in secret, knowing he could be severely punished. Iris hid the diary for years, knowing that if it was discovered, she'd be sold or worse. Elias coordinated a network of informants across hundreds of miles, using free black travelers and sympathetic whites to pass information back and forth. They did this for nearly 40 years, through financial panics, through cholera outbreaks, through increasing restrictions on enslaved people's movement and literacy, through the paranoia that gripped the South as the Civil War approached. They persisted, and what they created is irreplaceable. The Ridgefield Diary is one of the very few documents that shows slavery from the inside, from the perspective of the people who experienced it, in their own words and through their own choices about what to preserve. Historians have plantation ledgers that list enslaved people as property. We have bills of sale that reduce human beings to prices. We have advertisements for slave auctions. We have laws and court cases and census records. But we have very, very few documents created by enslaved people themselves that document the internal workings of the system. The Ridgefield Diary is precious because it's rare. And it's rare because the work of creating it was almost impossibly difficult and dangerous. How many other diaries like this existed? How many were destroyed, burned, lost? How many enslaved people kept their own records, maintained their own networks, documented their own histories, only to have those records vanish when they were sold or when they died? We'll never know. But the existence of the Ridgefield Diary suggests that enslaved people resisted their erasure in ways we're only beginning to understand. Memory keeping, documentation, information networks. These were acts of resistance as powerful as any physical rebellion. Today, the diary sits in the Natchitoches Historical Society. It's in good condition considering its age. The ink has faded but is still legible. The pages are brittle but intact. It's stored in an acid-free box in a vault where temperature and humidity are carefully controlled. Very few people ever see it, but it exists. And because it exists, the names inside it are preserved. Dinah, Thomas, Clara, Bess, Big Jack, Mary, Ruth, Peter, Jacob, Rose, Hannah, Benjamin, Elias, Iris, and 160 others whose names fill its pages. They were real people. They lived, they loved, they suffered, they were sold, scattered, separated. Many died far from where they were born, buried in unmarked graves, forgotten by everyone except the people who kept the diary. But they're not forgotten anymore, because 3 people refused to let them be forgotten. Because Elias said someone needs to remember. Because Benjamin wrote it down for 23 years. Because Iris continued the work and ensured it survived. The Ridgefield Diary is a testament to memory as resistance. It's proof that even in the most dehumanizing system ever devised, people found ways to maintain their humanity, to honor their connections, to bear witness. This is the story of a diary that shouldn't exist but does. This is the story of 3 people who risked everything to preserve memory. This is the story of 173 people whose names were written down, documented, remembered. They existed. They mattered. Someone remembered. What do you think about this story? Does it change how you understand the ways people resisted slavery? Do you think there are other diaries like this waiting to be discovered in archives, attics, or forgotten storage rooms across the South? If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about history and memory, please share this video with someone who loves untold historical stories. Hit that like button to support our channel. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest corners of forgotten history. Leave a comment below telling us what state you're listening from, and whether you've ever visited a historical archive or discovered something unexpected about your own family's past. This is Liturgy of Fear, reminding you that the past is never truly past. The stories we uncover, the names we preserve, the truths we remember, they shape who we are and who we can become. Until next time, keep questioning, keep listening, keep remembering.